Hello everyone, this is Twinless Twin coming at you with another modern video. Today we have a Sultai Yorion Reclamation deck. This deck is one that I recently played a variation of in a modern preliminary, and it felt pretty good to me, so I thought I should record a video with it. Basically, it takes a lot of the same principles of Autumn Burchett's Simic Nexus deck, but goes a little bit bigger with some copies of Mystical Teachings, as well as playing 80 cards to play Yorion. Yorion is a pretty strong companion, arguably the second strongest behind Luris, at least in the format of Modern. And it provides both a free clock in this deck, as well as a way to get some recursive value. So because we have Yorion, that allows us to play a lot less threats. In this deck, all we have is 4 Uro and 4 Icefang Codal as ways to win the game, as well as 2 Snapcaster Mage. And because we have Yorion, it's very unlikely that we actually don't find a threat and are unable to close the game. This is important against other combo decks as well as big mana decks. It's worth noting Yorion synergizes especially well with Wilderness Reclamation because you can play Yorion and then still have all of your lands untapped to cast any spells you might have drawn after Arkham's Astrolabe and Icefang Codal re-enter the battlefield and draw extra cards off of Yorion's trigger. In the deck, we have the key card for Wilderness Reclamation. The goal of this deck is to land a Wilderness Reclamation on turn 3 or 4 as often as possible, which allows you to utilize the extra mana it gives you to cast powerful instants such as Fact or Fiction or Cryptic Command, as well as Mystical Teaching. The endgame of the deck is Nexus of Fate. With Mystical Teachings, you can tutor Nexus of Fate once, maybe even twice, and you can use Mystic Sanctuary to loop any of these powerful 4 mana spells, Fact or Fiction, Mystical Teachings, and Cryptic Command. Uro is in the deck as both acceleration, a redraw, and some life gain, as well as a closer. It's a 4 of for now, but I definitely could see going down to a 3 of, because between all of the early cantrips, as well as Fact or Fiction, finding an Uro is very likely, and drawing multiples can be clunky. 4 Icefang Codal and 4 Astrolabe provide early cantrips as well as late game value you can get off Yorion's Blink ability, and they help smooth your mana out or provide early blockers. Astrolabe being in the deck is nice because it helps give Icefang Codal Death Touch earlier. Growth Spiral is actually one of the best early game plays, and an ideal turn 2 would be playing your second land, passing, and then having up either Remand or Growth Spiral. This gives you a lot of flexibility, as you can either ramp up to 4 mana where you have all these powerful spells, or if they play an important spell, then you can remand it and basically time walk your opponent. In the sideboard, we have 3 Aether Gust. This is for Primeval Titan decks, as well as sometimes you can bring in some copies against the aggressive red decks. We have 1 Mystical Dispute for blue decks. We have 1 Disfigure, again for aggressive decks, 2 Collective Brutality for aggressive decks, and 3 Dead of Winter. This is very good against Luris, as Dead of Winter is a great follow-up to whenever your opponent plays their Luris. Then you're able to clean up Luris and hopefully whatever creature they brought back. 2 Veil of Summer is good against Jund, decks that play Assassin's Trophy, Abrupt Decay, and even some of the blue-black counterspell decks that you see going around, as well as Cryptic Command decks. 1 Weather the Storm is also good against Burn. A lot of players like to play extra copies of Weather the Storm, 2 or 3 even, but for me personally, I've found it to be a little bit less effective against the Black-Red Prowess deck, as that deck grinds very well. Our deck does have a very strong late game, and I think that on average, we're able to overpower the Black-Red deck, which makes Weather the Storm still reasonable to have, but I find that early removal to slow down the deck has roughly the same effect and can be more applicable in different situations, whereas Weather the Storm can be a somewhat weak top deck, and if we find ourselves out of action, it can be kind of detrimental to draw. Pulse of Marasa is another fair option that we can play, and I'm just testing a 1-1 split between that and Weather the Storm to see which one I like more. But Pulse of Marasa also has the upside of being able to buy back lands if we are missing land drops, or it has the upside of being able to get back an Ice Fang Kotal or a Snapcaster Mage, or sometimes in corner cases an Uro, but usually you want Uro in the graveyard. So that's the deck. Let's go ahead and hop into our first match. All right, we are on the play here for round one. We'll reveal Yorion. Our opponent doesn't have a companion. What this usually means is our opponent is either playing Tron or Ad Nauseum. Those are the two most popular non-companion decks currently. And for both of those, I think our hand is pretty reasonable. So we're going to go ahead and keep. We're probably going to fetch a Watery Grave and opt. There is some upside to getting the Triome on turn one, but I think that opting is also pretty reasonable. So we're just going to go ahead and obviously lead on the fetch land and just pass. We'll see what our opponent's on and decide if we need to opt from there, basically. Okay, it is Ad Nauseum. This is a close matchup, I would say. We do have lots of permission, but Ad Nauseum does tend to have a reasonably favorable combo matchup or control matchup, just because it's able to go off at instant speed, and all it takes is the control player committing to playing one threat, and then Ad Nauseum can go off. So our goal in this matchup should primarily be to get down a Wilderness Reclamation before the opponent is able to have mana to go off. Once that happens, we're able to set up situations where we can play a threat and still be holding up mana for them to not be able to go off effectively. We're going to fire off this opt on the end step. Ice Fang Kotal's interesting. It's not what we want specifically, but it is a redraw, and our opponent seems to have a slower start. If I had to guess, because they haven't played any acceleration, they probably have Phyrexian Unlife and Simian Spirit Guide Ad Nauseum. That would be my guess, as well as very likely they have a Pact of Negation in their hand. When your Ad Nauseum opponent isn't playing any cantrips, they're not playing any mana acceleration, that makes the most sense to me. Our hand lines up okay against that. Drown in the Loch is currently not live at all. It doesn't counter anything except for Pact of Negation. However, Remand could be pretty nice to cast on their Phyrexian Unlife, but I'm going to bottom this Ice Fang Kotal regardless. We'd rather look for more counter magic, things like that. All right, we draw an Ice Fang Kotal anyways. Thank you, MTGO. We're going to play an island. It's important to try to hold your non-islands for as long as possible, because you have 3 Mystic Sanctuaries. So we're opening up a lot more avenues for us to Mystic Sanctuary back, maybe a Remand next turn, if we think that's what we want to do. So now we have to decide if we want to Remand this Unlife. I was going to Remand it if we didn't have a better play, but now that we have the Ice Fang Kotal, I actually think that the cantrip might be more valuable, and we can Remand their Ad Nauseum when they try to play that, as well as have Drown in the Loch to counter any Pact of Negation. So I think let's go ahead and cast the Ice Fang Kotal and see what we draw. And if it's Force of Negation, we could consider a counter here, but I think that most likely we're not going to counter. Mystic Sanctuary, okay. Getting a little bit mana flooded here. We go with the Scalding Tarn and just attack and pass. We're We're going to have to hope our opponent doesn't have too much permission to play back with ours. They also have to respect Cryptic Command bouncing their Phyrexian Unlife if they were to go for an Ad Nauseum. So it seems pretty hard for them to try to go off right now, but they could sequence something like try to go off on our end step and then go off again on their turn. So I think we are in a bit of trouble here if we don't draw something good. Do we want to put Opt on top? I think there's an argument that it could be good. It's better than a blind draw, and we're going to be on 5 lands, which means that we still are just going to have access to the same two spells. So by putting Opt on top, we lose the possibility of drawing Archmage's Charm and having Remand Archmage's Charm. That's the only thing we're losing. Let's put Opt on top. I think that with only one Archmage's Charm in our deck, I think that's not a big enough consideration for us. So we'll put the Opt on top. Then we'll go ahead and draw. Let's fire off this Opt right now. We'll bottom a land and draw another land. Okay. Play the Snow-Covered Forest and just get in. At this point, we're basically hoping that our opponent's hand is super clunky and we get some lucky draws off the top. Otherwise, I'd say we are definitely in a bit of trouble here. Our opponent not going for an end step Ad Nauseum is probably good news for us. We're also happy to see our opponent casting cantrips, as maybe our Drown in the Loch will be enabled at some point. It's definitely possible our opponent's hand is just very weak as well. It's unfortunate we're not really in a great position to punish that by drawing lots of lands instead of spells. Okay, so we can run back the same play of putting Opt on top. We only have one Mystic Sanctuary left in our deck, which is definitely worth noting. Let's use the Snow-Covered Forest to play that Astrolabe. It doesn't really matter, as we basically have perfect mana with 2 Astrolabes in play. But just small things like that can sometimes add up. All right. Go ahead and get in for 1. I guess there's an argument to Opt second main phase. Oh, never mind. I guess it yielded through our second main phase. I was going to say we could Opt second main phase because we could look for Wilderness Reclamation, but I don't think that that's necessarily always going to be correct. Our opponent passing here. I feel pretty confident that they have an Ad Nauseum in hand. It just wouldn't make a lot of sense for them to have anything else. So Mystical Teachings, while it's a good draw, is really awkward here. I think if we fire it off, we're basically dead. So let's untap. Snapcaster Mage is not a bad draw at all. Now we have, or we're close to Remand, Drown, and Snap Remand. Our opponent doesn't feel like they're under a lot of pressure here, which might actually work to our benefit as we are continuing to make land drops. Okay, they are going to go for an Ad Nauseum here. Let's go ahead and remand it. Fact or Fiction. Again, super awkward. All these spells are spells that we cannot cast just because Ad Nauseum puts so much pressure on you to basically not be able to ever tap out at this point. And this is why I don't think Ad Nauseum is the best matchup for control decks. So if we were to play a spell here, they would just be able to cast Ad Nauseum and win, right? So we now have to untap again and then I believe we can cast one of our payoff spells on this upcoming turn, but it's not ideal. We'll shock. So if they go for Ad Nauseum here, I'm going to try a different line of going Mystical Teachings for Abrupt Decay, targeting Phyrexian Unlife. And hopefully they're not going to see that coming. But if they do try to counter the Mystical Teachings, then we can Snap Remand the Ad Nauseum. Actually, I think we would just lose if that's the case. Our hands are somewhat tied, unfortunately. So let's see. They Ad Nauseum. We could... We could Snap Remand here. But then if they try again next turn, we're naked. If we go for the Mystical Teachings on Phyrexian Unlife, they could very likely win again. But we would have Snap Remand up still. I like the Mystical Teachings line the best, I believe. The other option is like to try to Foff into something, but we would basically have to hit a very good Foff for that to actually work out. So I'm not sure what our opponent thinks we're going to do, but I definitely like this Abrupt Decay line. It puts the opponent in a bit of an awkward spot. We do have nothing if they're able to go off again. So if they hit Angel's Grace, they did hit Angel's Grace. So if they have Ad Nauseum plus Angel's Grace, then we are dead. Never a good sign that they stop going. They are down to 4. They have 3 cards in graveyard, so we're not able to counter anything relevant here, unfortunately. And if they actually have the Angel's Grace Ad Nauseum, then I think we're likely very dead. Unfortunately, oh, spoils. Okay, so they're going to try to deck themselves and go for the Thassa's Oracle kill. So the question is, which do we counter? If we counter spoils, they could have another spoils. And if we counter... They revealed a Thassa's Oracle. They only revealed 1 spoils, I believe. I shouldn't have canceled that out so quickly. Reveals Angel's Grace, Thassa's Oracle. All right, let's counter the spoils, or at least try to counter the spoils. Counter target spell with environment cost less than or equal. Okay. We'll try to counter the spoils. They could have a Pact of Negation. And then we'd be dead. They could have another spoils, and we're dead to that. But if they have none of those, then we're in good shape. Oh, they just have another Ad Nauseum. Okay, that also will kill us. So, yes, I believe that does kill us. So if we had let our opponent deck themselves, and then they went for the Thassa's Oracle, and we had countered it, then they wouldn't have been able to take this line. So maybe that was an argument for why we should have waited and tried to counter the Thassa's Oracle. Yep, and they go Pentad Prism, Thassa's Oracle. Good game. Okay. On to the next one. Cards that look good. I think Collective Brutality seems solid. Mystical Dispute to answer their counterspells, as well as just a 3-mana mana leak, can sometimes be reasonable. Some number of Veil of Summer could be reasonable. I mean, easy cuts right off the bat is we definitely want to cut these 4 Fatal Push. So I think we're at least bringing in this. And the question is there another card that we're interested in cutting where we think Veil of Summer would be better? I think the second Veil of Summer is probably worth it because our opponent is likely to bring in discard spells, probably some number of Thoughtseize, as well as the fact that they run Pact of Negation. So Veil of Summer has some relevance. Cards that we want to cut. We obviously want to keep all of our counter spells. We can probably afford to cut 1 Uro. It is a good clock. 1 Ice Fang. I like Decay and Trophy. Drown in the Lock, I think, can be good enough. It wasn't great there because I didn't have any early cantrips, but even in the, we saw in the late game, it actually was able to have some relevance. 1 Mystical Teachings, I think, is reasonable. Well, we actually don't even need to cut that many cards. So it's just between which of these two do we want to cut, and I think the Uro is what we want to cut. Ice Fang cantrips early and provide some late game value as well as a slow, but at least a clock that you can play at instant speed. Is committing a threat on your turn is generally not where you want to be. Okay. On the play for game number 2, this hand is interesting. It's a bit awkward, but I think it's a keep. We have a Remand, we have a Cryptic Command, we have a Veil of Summer, we have 1 Astrolabe for a redraw. We definitely are looking to hit our second untapped land drop. We'd prefer not to have to drop the Mystic Sanctuary untapped, but if necessary, it's not the end of the world. And then we'll have Remand up. Growth Spiral. I was hoping we were going to get Thoughtseized there. That would have been the best situation, but it looks like it's just a Pentad Prism. I would have considered cycling Veil if our opponent casts Serum Visions, as missing land drops is pretty bad. And now we're in a bit of an awkward spot. Let's go ahead and lead on Ice Fang Kotal and hope to draw another land. I think it's okay to do this here. It's relatively unlikely our opponent is able to go off next turn. They would have to have a land, a Simian Spirit Guide, Angel's Grace, and an Ad Nauseum off of no cantrips. So if they just have the absolute nuts, and even then, they would have to pay some respect to Force of Negation as a card that we could have. So I think that for them to go off would be both ballsy and unlikely. And as so, I felt kind of comfortable committing the Ice Fang Kotal to try to hit another land, as I think the upside's pretty high. Looks like our opponent may have a Phyrexian Unlife here. Yep, they do. We'll get in and pass the turn. And once again, our opponent is threatening to kill us if we ever tap out, so... Interesting that they exiled Simian Spirit Guide here. I think that pretty strongly telegraphs a Veil of Summer. So how do we beat Veil of Summer? The truth is we cannot beat it right now. If we remand and they Veil, then we can't even draw into anything. If we Cryptic, I think we're just in a pretty bad spot here. But let's try remanding and see what happens. I guess if they Veil, then we have to go for a Growth Spiral and hope to spike one of our 2 Force of Negations. Maybe they have Mystical Dispute. I'm not up to date on Ad Nauseum lists, but I think that Veil of Summer is much more likely, if I remember correctly. It looks like it is a Veil here. So we're going to have to try... Also, Abrupt Decay would have worked here. If we had some way to remove the Phyrexian Unlife in response to the Veil, then we would have been safe as well. So, a bit of an aggressive line from our opponent, as they're losing to 2 pieces of relevant interaction, but I guess it's reasonable if they thought that they weren't going to get any better. All right, I think we're pretty likely dead here. Unfortunately. Yeah, we are dead. All right, well, that is match 1. Let's hop right into match number 2.